To understand how my family's complete neglect of my 70th birthday would ultimately trigger the most devastating financial reckoning in 3 generations of Richardson history, you need to understand exactly how 30 years of systematic generosity had gradually transformed my loving, grateful children into entitled, manipulative adults who viewed my endless giving not as extraordinary kindness that deserved appreciation, but as a baseline expectation that required no acknowledgement, reciprocation, or even basic respect for the woman who had sacrificed her own financial security to fund their comfortable lifestyles. And the transformation didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't the result of inherent character flaws or deliberate cruelty on my children's part. Instead, it was the predictable outcome of 3 decades of well-intentioned generosity that gradually established patterns of financial dependency and emotional entitlement that neither they nor I fully recognized until the consequences had become too obvious and damaging to ignore any longer. When my husband Robert died suddenly of a heart attack in 1993, leaving me a widow at 40 years old with 3 children aged 12, 15, and 17, I had made a conscious decision to use my substantial savings, life insurance benefits, and professional income to ensure that his death didn't derail our children's educational opportunities or force them to sacrifice their dreams because of financial limitations. Robert and I had always prioritized our children's futures over our own immediate comfort, and I was determined to continue that tradition, even without his income and partnership. The decision had seemed not just reasonable but morally necessary at the time. Lisa, my eldest at 17, had been accepted to Northwestern University with a partial scholarship that still required significant family financial contribution. Michael, 15, had shown exceptional talent in mathematics and science that suggested excellent college prospects if he could maintain his current academic trajectory without the stress of part-time employment. Sarah, my youngest at 12, had demonstrated artistic abilities that would benefit from continued private lessons and summer art programs that were expensive but potentially life-changing for her creative development. My forensic accounting career provided a comfortable income of approximately $75,000 annually in 1993, along with excellent benefits and strong job security in a growing field. Robert's life insurance and our accumulated savings provided additional resources that could fund college educations, extracurricular activities, and the kind of comprehensive support that would allow our children to focus on their education rather than worry about financial limitations or family economic stress. But more importantly, providing generous financial support felt like a way to honor Robert's memory and continue the partnership approach to parenting that had characterized our marriage. He had always believed that investing in our children's education and opportunities was the best use of our resources, and maintaining that investment strategy seemed like a way to preserve his influence and values in our family, even after his death. The early years of single motherhood had been challenging but manageable, with my children responding to family financial security by excelling academically, participating in meaningful extracurricular activities, and expressing genuine appreciation for the opportunities my support provided. Lisa graduated from Northwestern with honors and secured a good entry-level position at a Chicago marketing firm. Michael earned a full scholarship to Purdue University for engineering and seemed destined for a successful career in his chosen field. Sarah continued developing her artistic talents through high school and college, eventually earning a fine arts degree that positioned her for creative work that might not be highly paid but would be personally fulfilling. During this period, my financial support felt genuinely helpful and appropriate, providing the foundation for educational success and career development that would ultimately lead to independence and self-sufficiency. The pattern seemed sustainable and beneficial for everyone involved. I used my resources to invest in my children's futures. They applied themselves to education and career development, and the whole family benefited from stronger relationships built on mutual support and shared goals. But somewhere during the transition from college support to young adult assistance, the dynamics began to shift in ways that were subtle at first, but became increasingly problematic as the years progressed. What started as help with college expenses and career transition costs gradually evolved into ongoing support for lifestyle choices, emergency assistance for poor financial decisions, and regular subsidies that allowed my children to maintain living standards they couldn't afford through their own income and efforts. Lisa's transition from college graduate to working professional had been more expensive and complicated than any of us had anticipated. Her entry-level marketing position in Chicago provided enough income for basic living expenses, but not enough for the kind of apartment, wardrobe, and social life that seemed necessary for career advancement in her competitive field. When she asked for help with security deposits, professional clothing, and networking expenses, the requests seemed reasonable and temporary, investments in her career development that would pay dividends once she became established in her profession. But Lisa's financial requests had continued and escalated even as her income increased and her career advanced. There were always new expenses that seemed necessary for professional success: conferences that weren't covered by her employer, professional development courses that would enhance her qualifications, social activities that were essential for networking and career advancement. Each request was presented as a temporary investment in her future earning potential, but the requests never seemed to decrease, even as her salary grew and her professional position became more secure. Michael's engineering career had started more promisingly, with his technical skills and strong work ethic leading to steady promotion and salary increases that suggested he would achieve financial independence relatively quickly. But his personal financial management had proven far less disciplined than his academic and professional performance, with expensive hobbies, costly relationships, and poor investment decisions creating regular financial crises that required family intervention to prevent serious consequences. Michael's requests for assistance were always framed as emergency situations that required immediate response to prevent catastrophic outcomes. There were car repairs that couldn't wait, medical expenses that weren't covered by insurance, investment opportunities that required quick action, and relationship expenses that seemed necessary for maintaining important personal connections. His emergencies always felt genuine and urgent, but they occurred with suspicious frequency and often involved amounts that seemed disproportionate to the problems they were supposed to solve. Sarah's artistic career had developed exactly as we had hoped in terms of creative fulfillment and personal satisfaction, but had failed to provide the financial stability necessary for independent adult life. Her income from freelance graphic design work and occasional art sales was unpredictable and insufficient for consistent living expenses, let alone the kind of financial security that would allow her to build savings or plan for the future. Sarah's financial needs were the most understandable and sympathetic of my 3 children, because her struggles were clearly related to career choices that prioritized meaning and creativity over financial reward, rather than poor decision-making or irresponsible behavior. But her dependency had also become the most comprehensive and long-term, requiring regular assistance with rent, utilities, car expenses, health insurance, and virtually every aspect of adult financial responsibility. What made Sarah's situation particularly challenging was that her financial dependency seemed unlikely to change significantly in the future, because artistic careers rarely provided the kind of steady income growth that would eventually eliminate the need for family support. Unlike Lisa and Michael, whose financial problems seemed like temporary challenges that would resolve as their careers advanced, Sarah's need for assistance appeared to be a permanent feature of our family dynamics that would continue indefinitely, unless she abandoned her artistic pursuits for more financially practical career choices. By the time my children reached their 30s and began having children of their own, the pattern of family financial support had become so established and routine that none of us questioned whether it was healthy or sustainable for anyone involved. I was providing regular assistance with mortgage payments, childcare expenses, educational costs, medical bills, home repairs, car purchases, vacation funding, and emergency assistance that had become so frequent that emergencies seemed like a monthly occurrence, rather than unusual events requiring extraordinary response. The grandchildren had added an entirely new dimension to family financial dynamics, because requests for assistance were now framed as investments in the next generation's welfare and future opportunities, rather than simply help for adult children who should be managing their own financial responsibilities. Lisa's 3 children needed support for private school tuition, extracurricular activities, summer camps, and college savings plans that required substantial ongoing financial commitment. Michael's 2 children required assistance with medical expenses, educational support, and the kind of comprehensive care that would give them advantages their parents couldn't provide independently. Sarah's twin daughters, born when she was 35 and still struggling to establish financial stability, had essentially become my financial responsibility from birth, with their mother's artistic income insufficient to cover even basic childcare and educational expenses. The twins' needs weren't emergencies or special requests. They were ongoing financial obligations that required monthly support for housing, food, healthcare, education, and every other aspect of child-rearing that Sarah couldn't afford on her irregular freelance income. But perhaps the most problematic aspect of the expanded family financial dynamics was how naturally and automatically my support had evolved to include not just my children and grandchildren, but also their spouses, their extended family members, and even their friends when circumstances seemed to warrant assistance. Lisa's husband David had requested help with business startup costs for a consulting venture that never materialized. Michael's wife Jennifer had needed assistance with medical bills for her elderly mother. Sarah's various romantic partners had somehow become included in family financial support during their relationships with my daughter. The expansion of my financial responsibilities had occurred so gradually and seemed so reasonable in each individual case that I hadn't recognized how extensively my resources were being distributed among people who had no genuine family connection or long-term commitment to maintaining relationships with me beyond the period when my assistance was useful to them. I was essentially funding an extended network of people who viewed my generosity as an available resource rather than a personal relationship deserving of respect and reciprocal care. What my professional background should have helped me recognize much earlier was that the pattern of family financial relationships had evolved into a classic exploitation structure where one person's resources were being systematically redirected to support multiple people's lifestyle choices and poor financial decisions without any accountability, reciprocal responsibility, or even basic appreciation for the sacrifice involved in providing ongoing assistance to so many people for so many years. The mathematics of family financial support had become genuinely unsustainable from my perspective, not just because of the absolute amounts involved, but because of the opportunity costs and personal sacrifices required to maintain my ability to provide assistance to so many people on such a regular basis. I had delayed my own retirement, avoided major personal purchases, maintained a modest lifestyle, and carefully managed my investments and expenses to preserve my ability to respond to family financial needs whenever they arose. My own financial security had gradually become secondary to my family's financial convenience, with my savings, investment income, and even retirement planning essentially serving as a collective family resource that existed to solve other people's problems and fund other people's choices. I had transformed from an independent woman with her own financial goals and security needs into a family financial service that existed to provide assistance whenever it was requested, regardless of the impact on my own financial well-being or future security. But the most damaging aspect of 3 decades of family financial support wasn't the money itself. It was how the pattern had gradually eroded the genuine appreciation, reciprocal care, and authentic family relationships that should have been the foundation for any healthy family dynamic involving financial assistance. My children and grandchildren had learned to view my support as an entitlement rather than a gift, and they had stopped expressing genuine gratitude or providing reciprocal care because the assistance had become so routine and expected that it no longer seemed remarkable or worthy of special appreciation. The transformation had been so gradual that none of us had recognized how fundamentally it had changed our relationships and family dynamics. My children now contacted me primarily when they needed assistance, visited mainly when they wanted something, and expressed appreciation only when they were in the process of requesting additional help. Our conversations had become dominated by discussions of their problems, their needs, and their plans, rather than genuine interest in my well-being, my interests, or my own goals and challenges. Family gatherings had evolved into strategy sessions where my children updated me on their latest financial challenges and positioned me to provide solutions, rather than celebrations where we enjoyed each other's company and maintained emotional connections that existed independently of financial considerations. Holidays and birthdays had become opportunities for my children to present new requests for assistance, rather than occasions for expressing genuine appreciation for our relationships and family connections. But perhaps most tellingly, my children had stopped offering reciprocal care or assistance, even for situations where my needs were obvious and their help would have been meaningful and appreciated. When I had been hospitalized for pneumonia 2 years earlier, none of my children had visited during my 4-day stay or offered help during my recovery period. When I had needed assistance with home repairs after a storm damaged my roof, they had been too busy with their own priorities to help, even though I ended up paying contractors to do work that my sons could have handled easily. The pattern had become so one-sided that my children seemed genuinely surprised when I mentioned feeling unappreciated, or suggested that family relationships should involve mutual care and support, rather than one-way financial assistance. They had apparently learned to view my needs and feelings as secondary considerations that shouldn't interfere with their access to financial support when they needed it. My forensic accounting background had finally forced me to confront the reality that my family relationships had evolved into a financial exploitation structure that was depleting my resources, compromising my security, and providing virtually no genuine emotional satisfaction or reciprocal care in return. The loving family relationships I thought I was building through generous financial support had actually become transactional interactions, where my value was measured primarily by my willingness and ability to solve other people's financial problems. The documentation I had been maintaining for 15 years revealed patterns that were impossible to deny or rationalize away: increasing frequency of requests, escalating amounts, decreasing expressions of gratitude, minimal reciprocal care, and systematic avoidance of accountability or behavior change that might reduce future needs for assistance. My children had learned to exploit my love and generosity so effectively that they probably didn't even recognize how selfish and entitled their behavior had become. But the most damaging pattern revealed by my systematic record-keeping was how my children had learned to use emotional manipulation to maintain access to financial assistance while avoiding the genuine family relationships that should have been the foundation for any healthy dynamic involving mutual support and care. They expressed just enough affection to preserve my willingness to help, provided just enough contact to maintain access to assistance, and demonstrated just enough appreciation to prevent me from questioning whether our relationships were genuine or purely transactional. The emotional manipulation had been so sophisticated and effective that for many years I had genuinely believed that my financial support was building stronger family relationships, and that my children's appreciation was authentic rather than strategic. They had learned to exploit my desire for meaningful family connections by providing just enough emotional feedback to maintain my investment in their well-being, while avoiding the genuine reciprocal care and respect that should characterize healthy adult family relationships. Eleanor Richardson had spent 30 years funding other people's lifestyles and solving other people's problems, while gradually losing her own financial security and receiving virtually nothing in return except the increasingly hollow satisfaction of being needed by people who demonstrated no genuine care for her well-being or respect for her sacrifices. The pattern had been so gradual and skillfully managed that I had been complicit in my own exploitation for decades, before my professional instincts finally forced me to acknowledge the reality of what our family dynamics had become. But my children's most serious mistake was their complete failure to understand that their systematic exploitation of my generosity had been observed, analyzed, and documented by someone who possessed the professional skills and investigative training necessary to build a comprehensive case that would expose the true scope of their selfishness and ingratitude. While they had been busy developing increasingly sophisticated strategies for maximizing their financial benefits from my love and generosity, I had been building the evidence that would eventually be used to restore balance and teach long overdue lessons about gratitude, reciprocal care, and the true meaning of family responsibility. The family members who had spent 30 years treating my endless financial support as an entitlement rather than a remarkable gift were about to learn that systematic documentation is more powerful than emotional manipulation, and that underestimating someone based on their kindness and family loyalty can have consequences that extend far beyond uncomfortable conversations and temporary restrictions on financial assistance. My 70th birthday had provided the perfect catalyst for implementing the comprehensive family reckoning that my professional analysis had determined was necessary to restore healthy relationships and appropriate boundaries. The complete silence from all 3 children, 8 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren on the most significant birthday milestone of my life had finally provided the justification I needed to stop protecting people who had demonstrated no genuine appreciation for my sacrifices or respect for my feelings and well-being. The family members who had been too busy, too forgetful, or too indifferent to acknowledge my birthday were about to discover that some oversights have consequences that extend far beyond hurt feelings, and that taking someone's endless generosity for granted eventually creates debts that must be paid in full, with interest compounded over 30 years of systematic ingratitude and exploitation. What my ungrateful family didn't know when they ignored my 70th birthday completely, not a single phone call, text message, or acknowledgement that I was even alive, was that I had spent the last 30 years meticulously documenting every dollar I'd given them, every crisis I'd solved for them, and every time I'd put their needs before my own health and happiness. And this time, I was going to use every piece of evidence I'd carefully collected to show everyone that the family members they thought could take my endless generosity for granted were about to learn exactly what happens when you push the wrong grandma. Before I tell you how a supposedly forgotten 70-year-old woman used systematic record-keeping and strategic planning to deliver the most devastating lesson about gratitude that 3 generations of my family will never forget, tell me in the comments if you've ever felt taken for granted by people you've sacrificed everything for, and if this story of calculated justice for family and gratitude resonates with you. Make sure you hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow I have another incredible story about why you should never assume that someone's kindness means they're not keeping track of every favor. My name is Eleanor Ellie Richardson. I'm 70 years old, and I'm about to tell you how my selfish, entitled family, 3 children, 8 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren, who had spent 3 decades treating me like their personal bank account, emergency babysitter, and crisis management service, while never once expressing genuine gratitude or respect for my endless sacrifices, made the catastrophic mistake of completely ignoring the birthday of someone who had been quietly building the most comprehensive documentation of family financial exploitation and emotion. What my family didn't understand when they all somehow forgot my 70th birthday on October 15, 2023, was that the woman they had been systematically taking advantage of for 3 decades wasn't just a soft-hearted grandmother who couldn't say no to family requests for money, childcare, emergency loans, home repairs, college tuition, medical bills, and constant emotional support. I was actually a retired forensic accountant with 35 years of experience in financial investigation, corporate fraud detection, and the kind of systematic record-keeping that could When people look at me today, they see exactly what my family had trained themselves to see: a petite 70-year-old woman with soft gray hair that I style myself every Friday morning, wearing comfortable cardigans from department store clearance racks, and practical shoes from discount retailers. They see someone who drives a 12-year-old Honda Civic with a World's Best Grandma bumper sticker, and whose modest ranch-style home on Maple Avenue suggests traditional values, fixed income limitations, and the kind of simple lifestyle that implies limited resources and unlimited availability for family emergencies. My appearance reinforces every stereotype about elderly widows in small Midwestern towns. I shop with coupons at the local grocery store, attend the Methodist church where I've been a member for 43 years, and volunteer at the community center's senior meal program twice a week. My handbag is a practical black leather purse that I've carried for 8 years, containing reading glasses, peppermint candies, family photos, and a small notebook where I write down grocery lists, appointment reminders, and, as my family would soon discover, detailed financial records of every dollar I've given them over the past 30 years. When I walk into family gatherings, people instinctively speak to me with the gentle, slightly patronizing tone that many use with elderly relatives, assuming that my age automatically implies technological confusion, financial naivety, and emotional dependency on family relationships for validation and purpose. Store clerks automatically offer assistance with payment terminals and shopping bags. Restaurant servers speak slowly and suggest senior menu options. Medical office staff explain simple procedures multiple times, as if my silver hair and modest appearance indicate cognitive limitations rather than deliberate choices about how to present myself to the world. But what people don't see when they look at Eleanor Richardson is someone who spent 35 years working as a forensic accountant for Midwest Financial Investigations, a specialized firm that conducted complex financial fraud investigations for insurance companies, law enforcement agencies, and corporate legal departments. They don't see someone who developed extraordinary skills in document analysis, pattern recognition, and systematic evidence gathering that made me one of the most respected financial investigators in 3 states. My work at Midwest Financial had required me to reconstruct complicated financial crimes, track hidden assets, identify fraudulent transactions, and build comprehensive cases that could withstand aggressive legal challenges from highly paid defense attorneys. I had learned to follow money trails through complex corporate structures, identify patterns of deception that might span decades, and maintain documentation standards that could survive the most rigorous courtroom scrutiny. But perhaps more importantly, my professional experience had taught me to recognize the subtle signs of financial manipulation, emotional exploitation, and systematic deception that most people miss because they want to trust the people they love. I had seen every type of financial fraud imaginable, from sophisticated corporate embezzlement schemes to family members who systematically exploited elderly relatives' generosity and trust. I knew how predators operated, how they justified their behavior to themselves and others, and how they used emotional manipulation to prevent their victims from recognizing or responding to systematic exploitation. When I retired at age 65, I had brought these professional skills and investigative instincts with me into my personal life, though I had never expected to need them for analyzing my own family's behavior and motivations. But over the years, as my children and grandchildren's requests for financial assistance became more frequent, more urgent, and more obviously one-sided, I had begun applying the same analytical frameworks to family relationships that I had once used for investigating corporate fraud and insurance scams. The result was a collection of financial records, communication logs, and behavioral documentation so detailed and comprehensive that it would have impressed any private investigator, attorney, or law enforcement officer. But because my family had learned to see me as a generous, emotional grandmother whose love made her incapable of calculating the true cost of her constant giving, no one suspected that the woman who baked cookies for every family gathering and remembered every birthday and anniversary was actually conducting the most thorough investigation of family financial exploitation in Richardson history. My background in forensic accounting had also provided me with something that my family had seriously underestimated: a comprehensive understanding of financial psychology and the ability to recognize patterns of entitlement, manipulation, and exploitative behavior with remarkable accuracy. 35 years of investigating people who used emotional manipulation to cover financial crimes had taught me how to identify the signs of systematic exploitation, recognize rationalization patterns that justified taking advantage of generous family members, and understand the psychological mechanisms that allowed good people to gradually become comfortable with increasingly selfish and entitled behavior. I could recognize when someone was lying about their financial needs to get money for wants rather than necessities. I could identify people who were exaggerating crises to create urgency and prevent careful analysis of their requests. I could spot family members who were using emotional manipulation to make refusal seem cruel and unreasonable. And I could recognize the behavioral patterns that indicated when someone had stopped seeing family financial support as temporary assistance and started viewing it as an entitlement that they deserved regardless of their own behavior or my financial situation. These analytical skills had made me an extremely effective forensic accountant, but they had also given me the tools necessary to understand exactly how my family's relationship with money and generosity had evolved over 30 years, from genuine need and appreciation to systematic exploitation and entitled expectation. I could see the progression from grateful acceptance of occasional help to calculated manipulation designed to maximize financial benefit while minimizing personal responsibility and reciprocal care. My family's approach to requesting money and assistance had become increasingly sophisticated and strategic over the years, but it followed predictable patterns that someone with my background could easily identify and analyze. They used a combination of emotional manipulation, artificial urgency, and systematic erosion of boundaries that would have been effective against most generous elderly relatives. But they had chosen the wrong target for their exploitation campaign. The woman they thought they could easily manipulate as a loving grandmother whose emotions made her financially vulnerable was actually someone who understood financial manipulation better than they did, who possessed the skills and experience necessary to document their exploitation systematically, and who had the analytical training and investigative background to build a comprehensive case that would expose the true scope of their selfishness and ingratitude. But my family's most serious mistake was their complete failure to understand that the very qualities they were exploiting, my love for family, my generous nature, and my reluctance to create family conflict, were actually professional advantages that allowed me to observe and document their behavior without arousing their suspicion. They saw an elderly woman who could be easily manipulated through emotional appeals and family loyalty, but they were actually dealing with someone who had spent decades developing exactly the skills necessary to identify and defeat their type of systematic financial exploitation. My work in forensic accounting had taught me that the most dangerous financial predators were often family members who used love and loyalty as weapons against generous relatives who wanted to help but didn't know how to establish healthy boundaries or recognize manipulation tactics. I had investigated dozens of cases where elderly family members were systematically drained of their resources by children and grandchildren who had learned to view their generosity as an entitlement rather than a gift. The patterns were always the same: initial requests presented as temporary emergencies, gradual escalation of amounts and frequency, emotional manipulation to prevent questions or conditions, and systematic erosion of the giver's financial security while the takers maintained lifestyles they couldn't afford through their own efforts. The victims were usually loving, generous people who wanted to help their families succeed, but who lacked the analytical skills or emotional distance necessary to recognize when help had become enabling and when family support had become financial exploitation. But unlike the vulnerable elderly victims I had encountered in my professional investigations, I possessed both the analytical skills to recognize manipulation and the investigative training to document it systematically. While my family had been busy developing increasingly sophisticated strategies for maximizing their financial benefits from my generosity, I had been analyzing their tactics, documenting their patterns, and building a comprehensive case that would eventually expose the true scope of their selfishness and ingratitude. The decision to begin maintaining systematic records of my family's financial requests and my responses hadn't been made lightly or impulsively. For the first several years of providing family financial support, I had genuinely believed that I was helping my children and grandchildren through temporary difficulties and building stronger family relationships through mutual care and support. But as the requests became more frequent, the amounts larger, and the expressions of gratitude rarer, I had begun to recognize patterns that triggered my professional instincts about financial exploitation. The turning point had come approximately 15 years ago, when my daughter Lisa had requested $5,000 for what she described as an emergency roof repair that couldn't wait for her next paycheck. I had provided the money immediately, as I always did for family emergencies, but my professional curiosity had led me to drive past her house a few weeks later to see the progress on the roof work. Instead of finding evidence of roof repairs, I had discovered Lisa's driveway filled with shopping bags from expensive department stores, and her husband loading a new big-screen television into their living room. That incident had been my first clear indication that my family's financial requests might not always be as honest or necessary as they claimed, and it had triggered the same investigative instincts that had made me successful in corporate fraud detection. I had begun asking more questions about financial emergencies, requesting more details about how assistance would be used, and paying closer attention to my family members' actual spending patterns and lifestyle choices. But most importantly, I had begun maintaining detailed records of every financial request, every dollar provided, and every promise made about repayment or changed behavior. The documentation process I established was based on the same principles I had used for 35 years in professional fraud investigations: accuracy, completeness, objectivity, and legal defensibility. Every conversation was recorded with date, time, participants, exact amounts requested and provided, stated reasons for need, and promised timelines for repayment or behavior change. The systematic documentation of my family's financial patterns served two critical purposes. It provided me with objective evidence that could refute false claims about past assistance or current needs, and it helped me understand their strategic patterns so that I could recognize manipulation tactics and respond more effectively to future requests. After several years of careful observation and record-keeping, I had identified the specific techniques my family used to maximize financial assistance while minimizing accountability or reciprocal care. Their primary strategy was what I came to think of as crisis escalation, a systematic approach to creating artificial urgency that would prevent me from analyzing their requests carefully or establishing reasonable conditions for assistance. They would present routine expenses as emergencies, exaggerate the consequences of delayed assistance, and use emotional manipulation to make careful evaluations seem cruel and unreasonable. At the same time, they had developed sophisticated techniques for avoiding accountability or reciprocal responsibility. They would make vague promises about repayment that created emotional satisfaction without legal obligation. They would express appreciation in ways that felt meaningful, but didn't translate into changed behavior or reduced future requests. They would maintain just enough contact and affection to preserve access to financial assistance, while minimizing the time and emotional investment required to maintain genuine relationships. But perhaps most importantly, my family had learned to exploit my professional background and personality traits in ways that made refusal difficult and analysis seem unnecessary. They knew that my career in financial investigation had made me suspicious of people who tried to take advantage of vulnerable individuals, so they presented their requests as ways for me to help family members who were being victimized by circumstances beyond their control, rather than as ongoing financial support for lifestyle choices they couldn't afford. They understood that my natural generosity and family loyalty made me want to believe that my assistance was genuinely helpful and appreciated, so they provided just enough positive feedback and emotional connection to maintain my willingness to continue providing support without requiring them to demonstrate actual gratitude or behavioral change. The psychological manipulation was sophisticated and effective, designed to exploit my strengths and values while preventing me from applying my professional analytical skills to family financial dynamics. For many years, their strategy had worked perfectly, allowing them to maintain access to substantial financial assistance while avoiding the accountability and reciprocal care that should characterize healthy family relationships. But my family's manipulation strategy had a fatal flaw. It required them to assume that my emotional investment in family relationships would prevent me from applying my professional investigative skills to their behavior patterns. They needed me to remain emotionally invested in believing that my assistance was helping rather than enabling, and that their appreciation was genuine rather than strategic. What they hadn't understood was that my professional training had taught me to maintain emotional distance even from people I cared about when analyzing their financial behavior, and that my investigative instincts would eventually override my emotional preferences if the evidence became overwhelming enough. They had assumed that family love would make me willing to ignore obvious patterns of exploitation indefinitely, but they were wrong about both my emotional resilience and my professional integrity. After 15 years of systematic documentation, I possessed comprehensive evidence that my family's financial relationship with me had evolved from genuine need and appreciation to calculated exploitation and entitled expectation. The records revealed that over 3 decades, I had provided over $240,000 in direct financial assistance, countless hours of free childcare and household help, and emotional support during every crisis, while receiving virtually no reciprocal care, genuine appreciation, or even basic respect for my time and resources. But more damaging than the financial totals was the documented pattern of promises broken, lies told, and manipulation tactics used to maintain access to my generosity while avoiding accountability for their own financial choices and behavior. My family had systematically transformed my love and generosity into a resource to be exploited rather than a relationship to be cherished, and they had done it so gradually and skillfully that they probably didn't even recognize how selfish and entitled their behavior had become. The woman my family saw as an endless source of financial support and emotional labor was actually someone who had been conducting the most thorough investigation of family financial exploitation in 3 generations of Richardson history. My supposed emotional vulnerability had been the perfect cover for systematic evidence gathering that would eventually expose the true scope of their selfishness and ingratitude. While they had been busy developing strategies for maximizing their financial benefits from my generosity, I had been building a case that could demonstrate precisely how much I had given, how little I had received in return, and exactly what patterns of behavior had characterized our family relationships for the past 30 years. The grandmother they thought they could manipulate indefinitely, through emotional appeals and artificial crises, was actually someone who possessed comprehensive documentation that would soon be used to restore balance and teach long overdue lessons about gratitude, respect, and the true meaning of family responsibility. Eleanor Richardson was about to remind everyone that systematic record-keeping is the most powerful weapon against financial exploitation, and that underestimating someone based on their generosity and family loyalty can have consequences that extend far beyond uncomfortable conversations and hurt feelings. The family members who had spent 30 years taking my endless giving for granted were about to learn that some debts eventually come due, and that gratitude isn't just a nice sentiment, it's a requirement for continued generosity. The 70th birthday they had all forgotten was about to become the catalyst for the most comprehensive family reckoning in Richardson history, and the woman they had been treating as their personal financial resource was about to demonstrate exactly what happened when you pushed someone with forensic accounting skills and 30 years of documented evidence beyond their limit of tolerance for disrespect and ingratitude. My birthday had been ignored, but the education I was about to provide about the mathematics of family relationships and the true cost of taking people for granted would be remembered for generations. To understand how my family's complete disregard for my 70th birthday would serve as the final catalyst for exposing 30 years of systematic financial exploitation, you need to understand the sophisticated deception that characterized the early years of our financial relationship. Because what I initially interpreted as genuine gratitude, temporary assistance, and healthy family interdependence was actually the foundation for the most calculated and comprehensive manipulation campaign that 3 generations of Richardson children would ever orchestrate against someone whose only crime was loving them unconditionally. The early years of providing family financial support had been genuinely rewarding and emotionally satisfying, creating exactly the kind of close family relationships and mutual care that I had hoped to preserve and strengthen after Robert's death. My children's responses to my assistance during their college years and early career development had demonstrated the appreciation, responsibility, and reciprocal affection that made generosity feel like a meaningful investment in family relationships rather than a financial drain that compromised my own security and well-being. Lisa's gratitude during her Northwestern years had been particularly heartwarming and authentic, with regular phone calls that included detailed updates about her academic progress, heartfelt appreciation for the financial security that allowed her to focus on education rather than part-time employment, and genuine enthusiasm about how my support was enabling her to pursue internships and leadership opportunities that would enhance her career prospects after graduation. Her letters and calls during college had been filled with specific examples of how my assistance was making a meaningful difference in her educational experience and future opportunities. "Mom, I can't tell you how much your support means to me," Lisa had written in a letter during her sophomore year that I still have in my documentation files. "Knowing that I don't have to worry about basic expenses means I can focus entirely on my studies and take advantage of opportunities, like the marketing internship, that other students can't afford to pursue because they need paying jobs. I'm learning so much and making connections that will help me after graduation, and it's all possible because of your sacrifice and generosity." The letter had been accompanied by detailed descriptions of her coursework, specific examples of how her internship experience was building valuable skills, and thoughtful questions about my own work and interests that demonstrated genuine care for my well-being, rather than simply gratitude for financial assistance. Lisa's college communications had created exactly the kind of meaningful family connection that made financial support feel like a worthwhile investment in both her future success and our ongoing relationship. Michael's response to family financial support during his Purdue engineering program had been equally gratifying, with regular visits home that included enthusiastic presentations about his academic projects, detailed explanations of how his education was preparing him for a successful career, and obvious pride in sharing his achievements with someone whose support had made his educational opportunities possible. His academic excellence and professional preparation had seemed like direct validation that family financial investment was producing exactly the kind of outcomes that justified continued generosity and support. "I know how hard you work to support our family, and I want you to know that I'm not taking any of it for granted," Michael had told me during one of his visits home during junior year. "Every day I'm in class or working on projects, I think about how you're making this possible for me, and I'm determined to make the most of these opportunities so that your sacrifice pays off in my success and ability to contribute to our family in the future." Michael's academic achievements, scholarship maintenance, and obvious commitment to excellence had provided concrete evidence that my financial support was enabling genuine accomplishment, rather than simply funding lifestyle choices or poor decision-making. His engineering degree and subsequent job placement had seemed like proof that family financial investment could produce measurable returns in terms of career success and future financial independence. Sarah's artistic development during high school and college had been more challenging to evaluate in terms of conventional success metrics, but her passion, talent, and commitment to her creative work had provided emotional satisfaction that felt equally valuable as Lisa's career advancement and Michael's academic excellence. Watching Sarah develop her artistic abilities through private lessons, summer programs, and college coursework had created the kind of pride and connection that made financial support feel like a meaningful contribution to something beautiful and worthwhile. I know my art career isn't going to make me rich, but I hope you know how much joy and fulfillment your support has given me, Sarah had said during her college graduation celebration. You've made it possible for me to pursue something I love, instead of just choosing a career based on money, and that gift means more to me than any amount of financial success could. Sarah's artistic achievements, gallery exhibitions, and obvious happiness with her creative work had provided the kind of meaningful return on investment that couldn't be measured in dollars but felt equally valuable in terms of family relationships and individual fulfillment. Her gratitude for the opportunity to pursue meaningful work rather than simply financially practical career choices had seemed like validation that family support could enable the kind of authentic, purpose-driven life that money alone couldn't purchase. During these early years of family financial support, the pattern of requests and assistance had felt sustainable, appropriate, and mutually beneficial for everyone involved. My children were using financial assistance to build genuine skills, pursue meaningful opportunities, and develop the kind of personal and professional foundation that would eventually lead to independence and success. Their appreciation was obviously authentic, their progress was measurable and meaningful, and their reciprocal care and affection provided emotional satisfaction that made generosity feel like a worthwhile investment in family relationships. But perhaps most importantly, the early pattern of family financial support had included natural limitations and boundaries that prevented assistance from becoming dependency or entitlement. College expenses had clear endpoints tied to graduation timelines. Career development assistance was framed as temporary investment in long-term earning potential. Emergency assistance was genuinely rare and tied to specific circumstances, rather than ongoing lifestyle support. The requests were reasonable, the gratitude was authentic, and the assistance felt like genuine help rather than enabling or exploitation. The transition from healthy family financial support to systematic exploitation had been so gradual and skillfully managed that I didn't recognize the warning signs until the pattern had become firmly established and extremely difficult to change. The shift had occurred through a series of small boundary erosions and incremental changes that individually seemed reasonable but collectively transformed our family financial dynamics from mutual support to one-sided dependency. The first significant warning sign had appeared approximately 5 years after Lisa's college graduation, when her requests for financial assistance had continued and even increased despite her successful career advancement and steadily growing salary. Instead of the temporary help with career transition that I had expected, Lisa's financial needs had somehow expanded to include ongoing lifestyle support that seemed inconsistent with her professional income and advancement. Mom, I know I've been successful at work, but living in Chicago is so expensive, and there are always professional expenses that my salary doesn't quite cover, Lisa had explained during one of our conversations about her continued financial needs. I don't want to compromise my career advancement by cutting back on the networking and professional development that got me where I am, so I'm hoping you can continue helping with some of the extra expenses until my next promotion comes through. The explanation had seemed reasonable at the time, because I understood that career advancement often required investments in professional development, networking, and lifestyle maintenance that might not be immediately covered by current salary levels. But my forensic accounting instincts had been triggered by the vague nature of Lisa's financial explanations, and her obvious reluctance to provide specific details about her expenses or timeline for achieving financial independence. When I had gently suggested that Lisa provide more detailed information about her budget and financial goals so that I could better understand how to help her achieve independence, her response had been the first clear indication that our family financial dynamics were evolving in problematic directions. Instead of welcoming the opportunity to create a structured plan for reducing dependency, Lisa had become defensive and emotional about what she characterized as questioning her honesty and maturity. I thought you wanted to help me succeed, but now it feels like you don't trust me or you think I'm taking advantage of you, Lisa had responded with obvious hurt and irritation. I'm working hard and doing well in my career, but I guess that's not good enough if you're going to start treating me like a child who needs to justify every expense and prove that I deserve your support. The emotional manipulation had been subtle but effective, transforming my reasonable request for financial transparency into evidence that I was being unreasonably suspicious and unsupportive of her success. Lisa had skillfully shifted the conversation from her financial responsibility to my emotional response, making me feel guilty for asking questions that should have been standard practice for any ongoing financial assistance arrangement. But more troubling than Lisa's defensive response had been her obvious assumption that my financial support should continue indefinitely, without accountability, planning, or progress toward independence. She had somehow learned to view my assistance as an entitlement that shouldn't require justification, explanation, or even basic appreciation, beyond the minimal gratitude necessary to maintain access to continued help. Michael's transition from grateful college student to entitled adult had followed a similar pattern, but with different manipulation tactics that exploited my knowledge of his technical skills and professional success to make his ongoing financial needs seem like temporary setbacks rather than systematic poor decision-making. His engineering career had indeed been successful in terms of salary advancement and professional recognition, but his personal financial management had somehow become increasingly chaotic and crisis-prone, despite his obvious intelligence and technical competence. I know it seems like I should have my finances figured out by now, but there have been some unexpected expenses and investment opportunities that have stretched my budget temporarily, Michael had explained during one of his requests for emergency assistance. I'm making good money, and my career is going well, but I need some help getting through this rough patch so that I don't have to make compromises that could affect my long-term financial growth. Michael's financial crises had always been presented as temporary challenges that required immediate assistance to prevent more serious long-term consequences. There were investment opportunities that required quick action, professional expenses that couldn't be delayed, relationship costs that were necessary for personal happiness, and emergency situations that demanded immediate response regardless of their impact on my own financial planning and security. But the pattern of Michael's financial requests had revealed concerning behavioral trends that suggested his money management problems weren't temporary setbacks, but systematic issues that would likely continue regardless of how much assistance I provided. His emergencies occurred with suspicious regularity, his investment opportunities consistently failed to produce the promised returns, and his lifestyle expenses seemed to expand automatically to consume all available income plus whatever additional assistance I was willing to provide. When I had suggested that Michael might benefit from professional financial planning assistance or budget counseling that could help him develop better money management skills, his response had been similar to Lisa's defensive reaction, but with additional technical arguments designed to exploit my respect for his engineering expertise and professional competence. I understand finances and investments better than most people because of my technical background, Michael had replied when I suggested professional financial guidance. My problems aren't about not understanding money. They're about timing and temporary cash flow issues that will resolve themselves once my current projects pay off. Getting financial counseling would just be an unnecessary expense, when what I really need is short-term assistance to get through this transition period. Quote, Michael's confidence in his own financial expertise had been convincing enough to override my concerns about his money management patterns, and his technical competence in his engineering career had provided credibility for his claims about understanding financial planning and investment strategies. But my forensic accounting background should have recognized that technical skills in one area don't automatically translate to competence in financial management, and that intelligent people are often the most dangerous financial decision makers because their intelligence makes them overconfident about their ability to manage complex financial situations without professional guidance or systematic planning. Sarah's evolution from grateful arts student to financially dependent adult had been the most gradual and sympathetic of my 3 children, because her ongoing financial needs were clearly related to career choices that prioritized meaning and creativity over financial security, rather than poor decision-making or lifestyle inflation. But her dependency had also become the most comprehensive and long-term, requiring assistance with virtually every aspect of adult financial responsibility, rather than specific emergencies or temporary support. I know my art career isn't providing the financial stability that traditional careers offer, but I hope you understand how important this work is to me, and how much your support means for allowing me to pursue something meaningful, rather than just settling for a job that pays well, but doesn't feed my soul, Sarah had explained during one of our conversations about her ongoing financial needs. Sarah's financial dependency had been framed as a philosophical choice about the value of meaningful work versus financial security, and her obvious passion for her artistic pursuits had made it difficult to suggest that she should abandon her creative goals for more practical career choices. But my professional experience had taught me that financial planning and responsibility were essential life skills regardless of career choices, and that sustainable artistic careers required the same kind of business planning and financial discipline as any other professional pursuit. When I had suggested that Sarah develop business skills and financial planning strategies that could help her build a more sustainable artistic career, her response had revealed the same entitled assumptions about ongoing financial support that characterized Lisa and Michael's approaches to family assistance, but with additional emotional manipulation based on the supposed conflict between artistic integrity and financial responsibility. I understand that you want me to be more financially independent, but I'm afraid that focusing too much on the business side of art will compromise my creative integrity and turn something I love into just another way to make money, Sarah had responded when I suggested business development resources for artists. Right now, I can focus entirely on creating meaningful work because I know you support what I'm doing, but if I have to start treating art like a business, I'm worried that I'll lose the authenticity and passion that make my work special. Sarah's response had been particularly effective emotional manipulation because it positioned my reasonable suggestions about financial responsibility as threats to her artistic integrity and creative fulfillment. She had skillfully transformed my practical concerns about sustainability into evidence that I didn't understand or value her artistic goals, making me feel like an unsupportive mother who was trying to force her daughter to abandon her dreams for conventional financial security. But beneath Sarah's emotional arguments about artistic integrity, I should have recognized the same entitled assumptions about ongoing financial support that characterized all three of my children's approaches to family assistance. She had learned to view my support as enabling her to pursue meaningful work, but she had also learned to avoid the financial responsibility and business development that would actually make her artistic career sustainable and independent. The pattern that emerged from all three of my children's responses to my suggestions about financial planning, independence, and accountability was a sophisticated manipulation strategy that used emotional appeals, defensive reactions, and guilt-inducing arguments to maintain access to financial assistance while avoiding the responsibility and behavioral change that would reduce their dependency on my support. They had learned to frame my reasonable questions about their financial management as evidence that I didn't trust them, didn't support their goals, or didn't understand their unique circumstances. They had developed techniques for making me feel guilty about suggesting accountability, planning, or progress toward independence. And they had created emotional narratives that positioned continued financial dependency as evidence of close family relationships rather than exploitation of my generosity and compromise of my own financial security. But perhaps most insidiously, my children had learned to exploit my professional background and personality traits in ways that made their manipulation more effective and my resistance more difficult. They knew that my forensic accounting career had made me suspicious of people who exploited vulnerable individuals financially, so they presented themselves as hardworking people who were temporarily struggling, rather than entitled adults who were avoiding financial responsibility. They understood that my generous nature made me want to believe that my assistance was genuinely helpful, so they provided just enough progress reports and appreciation to maintain my emotional investment in their success without requiring them to demonstrate actual improvement or independence. The psychological manipulation had been sophisticated enough to override my professional instincts for several years, allowing problematic patterns to become firmly established before I recognized the warning signs that should have triggered immediate intervention and boundary setting. My children had essentially turned my own values and professional skills against me, using my desire to help family members and my respect for their individual goals and challenges to justify ongoing financial support that was actually enabling dependency and preventing the kind of personal growth and responsibility that would lead to genuine independence and success. Eleanor Richardson had been systematically outmaneuvered by three adults who had learned to exploit her love, generosity, and professional competence, while avoiding the accountability and reciprocal care that should characterize healthy family financial relationships. The early years of genuine gratitude and appropriate assistance had been transformed into a sophisticated exploitation system that maintained access to my resources while preventing me from recognizing or responding effectively to the manipulation. But my children's manipulation strategy had a fatal flaw that would eventually lead to their complete exposure and the restoration of appropriate family boundaries. They had underestimated both my professional analytical skills and my documentation habits, assuming that emotional manipulation would permanently override my forensic accounting instincts, and that family loyalty would prevent me from applying investigative techniques to their behavior patterns. The woman they thought they had successfully trained to provide ongoing financial support without accountability was actually someone who had been systematically documenting their manipulation tactics, analyzing their behavioral patterns, and building a comprehensive case that would eventually expose the true scope of their exploitation and ingratitude. The early warning signs they thought they had successfully deflected had actually triggered the most thorough investigation of family financial relationships in Richardson history. The false hope period was ending, and the systematic documentation phase was about to reveal exactly how extensively my children had learned to exploit someone whose only mistake was trusting that family relationships were built on mutual care, rather than one-sided financial convenience. To understand how my family's systematic exploitation would eventually be exposed through the most comprehensive financial investigation in Richardson history, you need to understand the precise moment when my professional instincts finally overcame my emotional investment in believing that my children's financial dependency was temporary, and their manipulation tactics were actually expressions of genuine need, rather than calculated strategies for maintaining access to my resources while avoiding accountability, responsibility, and the basic reciprocal care that should characterize healthy adult family relationships. The turning point had come during what I now recognize as the most revealing conversation in 30 years of family financial dynamics, when my daughter Lisa had requested $8,000 for what she described as an urgent investment opportunity that required immediate action to prevent missing out on potential returns that could change everything for her financial future. The request had been presented with the kind of artificial urgency and emotional manipulation that should have triggered immediate suspicion from someone with my professional background, but family loyalty and emotional investment had initially overridden my forensic accounting instincts until specific details began revealing patterns that were impossible to ignore or rationalize away. "Mom, I need to talk to you about an incredible opportunity that just came up," Lisa had said during a phone call on a Tuesday evening in March 2018, using the slightly breathless tone that I had learned to associate with requests for substantial financial assistance. "David's business partner has a chance to invest in a startup technology company that's about to go public, but we need to move fast because the window for getting in at the ground level closes this Friday." The timeline for Lisa's investment opportunity had been the first red flag that should have triggered immediate skeptical analysis, because legitimate investment opportunities rarely require immediate decisions without adequate time for research, analysis, and consultation with financial professionals. But Lisa's presentation had been sophisticated enough to address potential concerns while creating emotional pressure that made careful evaluation seem like unnecessary delay that could cost the family a life-changing financial opportunity. "I know $8,000 is a lot of money, and I wouldn't ask if I wasn't completely confident that this is going to pay off in a big way," Lisa had continued, using language that demonstrated understanding of my likely concerns while simultaneously dismissing them as unnecessary given the supposed certainty of positive outcomes. "David's partner has inside information about the company's plans, and everyone who gets in now is going to see incredible returns when the public offering happens next month." Lisa's request had included several elements that my professional experience should have immediately recognized as classic indicators of investment fraud or financial manipulation: artificial urgency, claims of inside information, promises of extraordinary returns, and pressure to make immediate decisions without adequate time for independent verification or professional consultation. But the request had been packaged with enough sophisticated financial terminology and apparent insider knowledge to create credibility, and it had been presented by someone whose professional success and family relationship made deception seem unlikely and suspicion seem inappropriately paranoid. But the most concerning aspect of Lisa's investment request hadn't been the financial details themselves. It had been her obvious assumption that I would provide the money immediately without requiring detailed documentation, independent verification, or even basic information about the specific company and investment structure she was proposing. She had presented the request as though my financial assistance was an automatic resource that could be deployed for any opportunity she deemed worthwhile, regardless of the risk to my own financial security or the impact on my retirement planning and long-term financial stability. When I had responded with questions about the investment company, the specific terms of the opportunity, and the documentation that would be required for any legitimate investment transaction, Lisa's reaction had revealed the sophisticated manipulation tactics that she had apparently been developing for years to maintain access to my financial resources, while avoiding the accountability and transparency that should be required for any substantial financial assistance between family members. Mom, I understand that you want to be careful with your money, but this isn't the kind of opportunity where we can take weeks to do research and get second opinions. Lisa had responded with obvious frustration when I suggested that we should have the investment opportunity reviewed by my financial advisor before proceeding. The whole point is that this is an exclusive opportunity for people who are connected enough to get inside information and decisive enough to act quickly when chances like this come up. Lisa's response had been designed to exploit my respect for her professional competence, while making my reasonable request for verification seem like evidence that I didn't trust her judgment or understand the sophisticated nature of the investment opportunity she was presenting. She had skillfully transformed my professional caution into a personal slight that suggested I was being unnecessarily suspicious of her honesty and competence, rather than applying standard financial analysis to a substantial investment request. But perhaps more revealing had been Lisa's obvious irritation with my suggestion that any major financial decision should be discussed with professional advisors and carefully analyzed before committing significant resources. Her expectation that I would provide $8,000 immediately based on her verbal description of an investment opportunity suggested that she had learned to view my financial resources as extensions of her own decision-making authority, rather than separate assets that required independent analysis and protection. The conversation had continued for over an hour, with Lisa becoming increasingly frustrated and emotionally manipulative as I continued asking questions about investment details, risk assessment, and documentation requirements that should have been routine elements of any legitimate financial opportunity. Her responses had revealed an obvious pattern of deflection, emotional pressure, and guilt-inducing arguments designed to override my analytical process and secure immediate financial commitment without the transparency and accountability that any reasonable investment decision would require. I thought you trusted me and wanted to support my financial success, but now it feels like you're treating me like a stranger who's trying to scam you, Lisa had said when I insisted on having the investment opportunity independently verified before providing any money. This is exactly the kind of chance that could set our whole family up for financial security. But if you're going to question everything and treat me like I don't know what I'm talking about, maybe I should just forget about trying to include you in opportunities like this. The emotional manipulation had been sophisticated and effective, designed to make me feel guilty for applying basic financial analysis to a substantial investment request, while simultaneously threatening to exclude me from future opportunities if I continued requiring the kind of transparency and verification that any legitimate investment would easily accommodate. Lisa had essentially argued that trusting her meant abandoning professional financial analysis, and that family loyalty required providing money immediately without the documentation and verification that any prudent investor would demand. But the conversation that should have ended with my agreement to provide the requested investment funds had instead triggered the forensic accounting instincts that I had been suppressing for years in favor of maintaining family harmony and supporting my children's financial goals and opportunities. Something about Lisa's artificial urgency, her reluctance to provide verifiable details, and her obvious frustration with reasonable questions had activated the same analytical processes that I had used professionally to identify financial fraud and investment scams. After ending the conversation with a promise to think about Lisa's investment request, I had spent the evening applying systematic investigative techniques to the limited information she had provided about the supposed investment opportunity. The analysis had taken less than 2 hours to reveal that the technology company she had mentioned was actually under investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission for fraudulent business practices, that the public offering she had referenced was not scheduled or approved by any regulatory agency, and that the entire investment opportunity was likely a sophisticated scam designed to exploit people who had access to substantial cash reserves. The investigation that should have prevented me from losing $8,000 to an investment fraud had instead revealed something far more disturbing. My daughter had either been completely deceived by obvious financial fraud, which suggested poor judgment and inadequate research skills, or she had been attempting to deceive me using information she knew was false, which suggested deliberate manipulation and potential complicity in fraudulent activity designed to exploit my financial resources. Neither possibility was acceptable for someone whose professional competence and family relationship should have protected me from exposure to obvious financial fraud, and both possibilities suggested that my children's financial judgment and honesty were far more problematic than I had previously recognized or acknowledged. The incident had forced me to confront the reality that my family financial relationships might be characterized by patterns of deception, manipulation, and exploitation, rather than the mutual trust and reciprocal care that I had assumed were the foundation for our ongoing financial arrangements. But the most disturbing aspect of the investment fraud incident hadn't been Lisa's poor judgment or potential dishonesty. It had been my own realization that I had been so emotionally invested in maintaining family harmony and supporting my children's financial goals that I had systematically ignored or rationalized away obvious warning signs that should have triggered immediate professional skepticism and investigative analysis. My family loyalty had essentially disabled my professional analytical skills, making me vulnerable to exactly the kind of financial manipulation and exploitation that I had spent 35 years helping other people identify and prevent. The recognition that my emotional investment in family relationships had compromised my professional judgment and financial security had been devastating, but it had also been liberating in ways that I hadn't expected. For the first time in years, I had applied systematic analytical techniques to family financial dynamics, and the results had been both shocking and revelatory in terms of understanding patterns that I had been unconsciously avoiding or deliberately ignoring. The decision to begin systematic documentation and analysis of all family financial interactions hadn't been made impulsively or emotionally, but rather as a deliberate professional response to evidence that my family relationships might be characterized by patterns of financial manipulation that required the same kind of systematic investigation that I had once applied to corporate fraud and insurance scams. If my children were systematically exploiting my generosity and trust, then professional documentation and analysis would reveal patterns that could guide appropriate responses and boundary setting. The documentation system I established was based on the same principles and methodologies that I had used for 35 years in forensic accounting investigations: comprehensive record keeping, objective analysis, pattern recognition, and evidence preservation that could withstand aggressive challenges and provide irrefutable proof of financial relationships and behavioral patterns. Every conversation would be recorded with date, time, participants, specific amounts requested and provided, stated reasons for assistance, and detailed analysis of claims made and evidence provided to support those claims. But perhaps more importantly, the documentation system would include verification procedures designed to independently confirm or refute the explanations and claims that my children made when requesting financial assistance. Emergency situations would be investigated to determine whether they were genuine crises or manufactured urgency designed to prevent careful analysis. Investment opportunities would be professionally evaluated to assess their legitimacy and potential returns. Lifestyle expenses would be analyzed to determine whether they represented genuine needs or discretionary spending that should be funded through personal income rather than family assistance. The systematic approach to family financial documentation had immediately revealed patterns that were far more disturbing than even my professional suspicions had suggested. Lisa's investment fraud request had not been an isolated incident of poor judgment, but rather part of a systematic pattern of financial requests that were either based on false information or designed to exploit my trust and generosity for purposes that were inconsistent with the explanations she provided when requesting assistance. Michael's emergency financial requests had followed similar patterns of artificial urgency, inadequate documentation, and claims that could not be independently verified when subjected to professional investigation. His car repairs had been quoted at amounts that were significantly higher than industry standards. His medical expenses had included charges for services that were not covered by insurance for suspicious reasons. And his investment losses had occurred in financial vehicles that demonstrated either incredibly poor judgment or deliberate deception about the risks involved. Sarah's ongoing financial dependency had been the most difficult to analyze objectively because her artistic career genuinely provided irregular income that made traditional financial planning challenging. But systematic documentation had revealed that her financial management was far more problematic than irregular income alone could explain. with patterns of spending that consistently exceeded her available resources and lifestyle choices that required ongoing family subsidies to maintain sustainability. But the most shocking discovery from systematic family financial documentation had been the sheer scope and duration of financial assistance that I had been providing without adequate record-keeping or analysis. Over the 15 years since my children had graduated from college, I had provided more than $160,000 in direct financial assistance, not including the value of ongoing services like childcare, transportation, home repairs, and emergency assistance that would have cost substantial amounts if purchased from professional providers. The mathematical analysis of 3 decades of family financial support had revealed that I had essentially been funding my children's lifestyle choices and poor financial decisions at the expense of my own retirement security and long-term financial stability. My savings had been systematically redirected from retirement planning and personal financial goals to subsidizing adult children who had learned to view family financial assistance as an entitlement rather than extraordinary generosity that deserved appreciation and reciprocal care. But perhaps most damaging had been the documentation of my children's systematic avoidance of accountability, reciprocal responsibility, and genuine appreciation for the financial assistance they had been receiving for decades. Phone calls and visits had become dominated by requests for money and discussions of their financial problems, with minimal interest in my own well-being, challenges, or goals. Family gatherings had evolved into strategy sessions, where my children positioned me to provide solutions to their latest financial crises, rather than celebrations, where we enjoyed each other's company and maintained emotional connections, independent of financial considerations. The systematic documentation had also revealed patterns of emotional manipulation that were far more sophisticated and calculated than I had previously recognized or acknowledged. My children had learned to exploit my love for family, my desire to help them succeed, and my reluctance to create family conflict to maintain access to financial assistance, while avoiding the genuine behavioral change and personal growth that would reduce their dependency on my support. They had developed techniques for making me feel guilty about suggesting accountability or progress toward independence. They had learned to frame my reasonable questions about their financial management as evidence that I didn't trust them or support their goals. And they had created emotional narratives that positioned continued financial dependency as evidence of close family relationships, rather than exploitation of my generosity and compromise of my own financial security. But the most disturbing pattern revealed by systematic documentation had been my children's systematic avoidance of reciprocal care or assistance, even for situations where my needs were obvious and their help would have been meaningful and appreciated. When I had been hospitalized for pneumonia, none of them had visited or offered assistance during recovery. When I had needed help with home repairs, they had been too busy with their own priorities to help, even though the work was within their capabilities and would have saved me substantial contractor expenses. The pattern had become so one-sided that my children seemed genuinely surprised when I mentioned feeling unappreciated or suggested that family relationships should involve mutual care and support, rather than one-way financial assistance flowing exclusively from me to them. They had apparently learned to view my needs and feelings as secondary considerations that shouldn't interfere with their access to financial support when they needed it. The documentation process had also revealed the sophisticated nature of my children's coordination in exploiting family financial resources. They had learned to time their requests to avoid competing with each other for available assistance, and they had developed strategies for supporting each other's financial appeals when my resistance to ongoing assistance seemed to be increasing. Lisa would mention Michael's difficult situation when requesting assistance for herself, creating implied pressure to help both children or risk seeming unfairly selective in my generosity. Michael would reference Sarah's artistic struggles when requesting emergency assistance, positioning his own financial crisis as less serious than his sister's ongoing challenges, while simultaneously creating emotional pressure to continue supporting both children's financial needs. Sarah would express concern about Lisa's professional expenses or Michael's investment losses when requesting assistance for herself, creating a family dynamic where refusing help for one child seemed like abandoning all 3 children, rather than simply declining a specific request for financial assistance. The coordination of manipulation tactics had been subtle but effective, designed to maximize the emotional pressure for continued assistance while making it difficult to establish boundaries or reduce support for individual children without seeming to abandon family relationships entirely. My children had essentially created a system where my financial resources were treated as collective family assets that existed to solve anyone's problems and fund anyone's goals, regardless of the impact on my own financial security or the sustainability of ongoing assistance arrangements. Eleanor Richardson had spent 2 years conducting the most thorough investigation of family financial exploitation that anyone could imagine, and the results had been more devastating and comprehensive than even my professional experience had prepared me to discover. The loving family relationships I thought I had been building through generous financial support had actually become systematic exploitation arrangements, where my value was measured primarily by my willingness and ability to solve other people's financial problems, without requiring accountability, appreciation, or reciprocal care. But the systematic documentation had also provided me with something that my children had not expected and could not counter: irrefutable evidence of their financial manipulation, emotional exploitation, and systematic ingratitude that could be used to restore appropriate boundaries and teach long overdue lessons about reciprocal responsibility and genuine family relationships. The woman they thought they had trained to provide ongoing financial support without question was actually someone who had been building a comprehensive case that would eventually expose their true character and force accountability for decades of taking advantage of someone whose only mistake was loving them unconditionally. The documentation phase was complete, and the evidence was overwhelming. My children had systematically exploited my generosity, manipulated my emotions, and avoided accountability for 30 years, while compromising my financial security and receiving virtually no genuine appreciation or reciprocal care in return. The false hope period was definitively over, and the systematic documentation had revealed patterns that could no longer be ignored, rationalized, or endured without consequences. The woman my family had been taking for granted was about to demonstrate exactly what happened when you systematically exploited someone who possessed both the professional skills to document your behavior and the moral authority to demand accountability for decades of ingratitude and manipulation. The investigation was complete, and justice was about to be served with the precision and thoroughness that only comes from comprehensive evidence and systematic analysis of financial relationships that had evolved from family support to systematic exploitation. My children's manipulation strategy was about to encounter the one thing they had not anticipated: a complete and irrefutable accounting of their true behavior towards someone whose generosity they had systematically exploited for their own benefit, while providing virtually nothing in return except the minimal appreciation necessary to maintain access to continued financial assistance. To understand how my family's complete disregard for my 70th birthday would serve as the final justification for exposing 30 years of documented financial exploitation, you need to understand how their manipulation tactics escalated and became more aggressive once they sensed that my systematic documentation and growing resistance to unreasonable requests represented a threat to the comfortable financial arrangement they had spent decades establishing and perfecting at my expense and to my detriment. The escalation phase had begun approximately 18 months before my forgotten birthday, when my children had apparently recognized that my questions about accountability, my requests for verification, and my obvious reluctance to continue providing unlimited financial assistance without reciprocal care or genuine appreciation indicated that their access to my resources might no longer be guaranteed or automatic. Their response to this perceived threat had been to intensify their manipulation tactics, while simultaneously coordinating their efforts to maintain collective access to family financial support through increasingly sophisticated psychological pressure and emotional blackmail. The first indication that my children were deliberately escalating their exploitation strategy had come during what I now recognize as a carefully orchestrated family intervention, designed to convince me that my growing resistance to their financial requests was evidence of declining mental capacity rather than reasonable boundary setting, by someone who had finally recognized patterns of systematic manipulation and exploitation that had been developing for decades. The intervention had been scheduled as a family dinner at Lisa's house in November 2022, ostensibly to celebrate my 69th birthday, with what she described as an intimate gathering, where we could important family matters without the distractions that sometimes interfere with meaningful conversations. The invitation had seemed thoughtful and genuine, suggesting that my children had finally recognized the need for more authentic family relationships that included reciprocal care and genuine interest in my well-being, rather than the transactional interactions that had characterized our relationships for years. But what I had expected to be a celebration of family relationships and genuine appreciation for my role in supporting everyone's success and security had instead been a calculated psychological manipulation session designed to convince me that my recent questions about financial accountability were symptoms of age-related cognitive decline that required family intervention and management, rather than legitimate concerns about sustainable financial relationships and appropriate boundaries. Mom, we've all been talking and we're concerned about some changes we've noticed in your thinking and behavior lately, Lisa had announced after dinner, using the kind of gentle but authoritative tone that suggested she was delivering a difficult but necessary family message. We know that aging can affect judgment and decision-making in ways that aren't always obvious to the person experiencing them, and we want to make sure you get the support and guidance you need to stay safe and secure. The phrase changes we've noticed in your thinking and behavior had been particularly calculated to create doubt about my own perceptions and judgment while positioning my children as caring family members who were courageously addressing a difficult situation rather than manipulative adults who were trying to maintain access to financial resources by discrediting my ability to make independent decisions about my own money and financial security. Michael had followed Lisa's opening with what appeared to be specific examples of my supposed cognitive decline, but which were actually distorted interpretations of incidents where I had applied professional financial analysis to their requests instead of providing automatic assistance without questions or conditions. We've noticed that you seem more suspicious and paranoid about things that used to be simple family discussions, Michael had said with obvious concern and disappointment. When I needed help with the car repair emergency last month, you acted like I was trying to deceive you instead of just asking for temporary assistance like we've always done. That kind of mistrust and suspicion isn't like you, and it's making all of us worried about whether you're thinking clearly about family relationships. Quote, Michael's reframing of my legitimate questions about his car repair costs as suspicion and paranoia had been a masterful manipulation tactic that transformed my reasonable request for documentation and verification into evidence of mental decline, while simultaneously making him appear to be a caring son who was concerned about his mother's well-being, rather than an adult who was frustrated by increasing accountability requirements for financial assistance. But perhaps most revealing had been Michael's assertion that questioning family financial requests wasn't like me, which suggested that he had learned to view my previous willingness to provide assistance without questions or verification as my authentic personality, rather than the result of emotional manipulation and systematic boundary erosion that had occurred over decades of gradually escalating financial dependency and exploitation. Sarah had contributed to the family intervention with emotional appeals designed to exploit my love for my grandchildren while suggesting that my growing resistance to unlimited financial assistance was actually harming family relationships and creating stress that was affecting everyone's well-being and security. Mom, I'm worried that these changes in your attitude toward helping family are affecting the kids, Sarah had said with obvious distress and concern. The twins have been asking why Grandma seems upset with us lately, and I don't know how to explain that you're going through some kind of difficult transition that's making family relationships more complicated and stressful for everyone involved. Sarah's manipulation had been particularly sophisticated because it suggested that my children had been discussing my supposed mental decline with my grandchildren, creating family stress and confusion that could be resolved if I simply returned to providing financial assistance without questions or accountability requirements. She had essentially argued that protecting my grandchildren from family stress required me to abandon reasonable financial boundaries and continue funding adult children's lifestyle choices and poor financial decisions regardless of the impact on my own security and well-being. But the most devastating aspect of the family intervention had been the revelation that my children had apparently been coordinating their interpretation of my behavior for months, creating a collective narrative about my supposed cognitive decline that justified continued financial exploitation while discrediting any resistance or boundary setting as evidence of mental incompetence rather than legitimate concerns about sustainable family financial relationships. They had systematically reframed every instance of professional financial analysis as paranoid suspicion, every request for accountability as unreasonable mistrust, and every suggestion about progress toward independence as evidence that I no longer understood or valued family relationships. The manipulation had been comprehensive and coordinated, designed to make me doubt my own perceptions and judgment, while maintaining their access to financial resources through psychological pressure and emotional blackmail. "We love you and want to support you through this difficult time." Lisa had concluded the intervention with apparent sincerity and concern. "But we need you to understand that fighting us when we ask for help isn't protecting your interests. It's just creating stress and conflict that's harmful to everyone, especially you. We're not trying to take advantage of you. We're trying to maintain the close family relationships that have always been the foundation of our happiness and security." Lisa's conclusion had been a masterpiece of psychological manipulation that positioned continued financial exploitation as evidence of family love, while suggesting that my resistance to unlimited assistance was actually harmful to my own interests and well-being. She had skillfully transformed their desire to maintain access to my resources into concern for my emotional and psychological health, making refusal seem like self-destructive behavior rather than reasonable boundary setting. The family intervention had failed to convince me that my growing resistance to financial exploitation was evidence of cognitive decline, but it had succeeded in revealing the sophisticated coordination and psychological manipulation that my children were willing to employ to maintain access to my resources while avoiding accountability or reciprocal responsibility. They had demonstrated that they viewed my money as a family resource, that they were entitled to access regardless of my own financial needs or security, and that they were prepared to question my mental competence rather than respect my right to make independent decisions about my own financial resources. But perhaps most importantly, the intervention had provided me with irrefutable evidence that my children's financial requests were not simply individual needs or emergencies, but rather part of a coordinated exploitation strategy that included systematic manipulation of my emotions, deliberate distortion of my behavior and motivations, and calculated psychological pressure designed to maintain access to financial assistance while preventing genuine accountability or behavioral change. The documentation of the family intervention had become a crucial piece of evidence in my systematic investigation of family financial exploitation, because it revealed that my children were not simply making individual requests for assistance based on genuine needs, but were actively coordinating their efforts to maximize financial benefits while minimizing accountability and reciprocal responsibility. They had essentially formed a conspiracy to exploit my generosity and manipulate my emotions for their collective financial benefit. Following the failed intervention, my children had escalated their manipulation tactics in ways that became increasingly obvious and desperate, as they recognized that psychological pressure and emotional blackmail were no longer sufficient to maintain unlimited access to my financial resources. Their requests for assistance had become more frequent, the amounts had increased significantly, and the artificial urgency had intensified to levels that would have been laughable if the financial impact hadn't been so serious and the emotional manipulation hadn't been so cruel and calculating. Lisa's financial requests during the escalation phase had evolved from sophisticated investment opportunities and professional development expenses to increasingly transparent attempts to fund lifestyle choices and discretionary spending that she couldn't afford through her own income, despite earning a substantial salary in her marketing career. Her explanations for financial assistance had become vaguer and less credible, but her expectations for immediate approval and assistance had actually increased rather than decreased, as her stories became more obviously fabricated. "Mom, I really need help with some unexpected expenses that have come up this month," Lisa had said during a phone call in early 2023, without providing any specific information about the nature of the expenses or the amounts involved. "I know I've been asking for help more often lately, but things have been really challenging financially, and I'm hoping you can assist me through this rough patch so I don't have to make some difficult decisions about my budget and lifestyle." Lisa's request had been notable for its complete lack of specific information about her financial needs, her obvious assumption that I would provide assistance regardless of the vague nature of her explanation, and her subtle threat that refusing assistance would force her to make difficult decisions about her lifestyle, suggesting that my financial support was necessary to maintain her current standard of living rather than help with genuine emergencies or temporary difficulties. When I had responded with questions about the specific nature of her expenses and the amount of assistance she needed, Lisa's reaction had revealed the extent to which she had learned to expect immediate financial support without accountability, documentation, or even basic information about how the assistance would be used. "I don't understand why you need so many details about every little thing," Lisa had replied with obvious frustration and irritation when I asked for specific information about her financial needs. We've always been able to work through these situations without making them into big, complicated discussions about budgets and explanations. Can't you just trust me and help me out like you always have? Lisa's response had demonstrated that she viewed my requests for basic information about financial assistance as unnecessary complications rather than reasonable requirements for responsible financial decision-making. She had apparently learned to expect that family financial support should be provided automatically without questions, accountability, or concern for the impact on my own financial planning and security. Michael's escalation tactics had focused on creating increasingly dramatic emergencies that required immediate financial intervention to prevent catastrophic consequences that would supposedly affect not just him personally, but his entire family's security and well-being. His crisis scenarios had become more elaborate and emotionally manipulative, designed to exploit my concern for my grandchildren's welfare while preventing careful analysis of his claims and financial management decisions. Mom, I hate to call you with another emergency, but we're facing a really serious situation that could affect the kids if I can't get some immediate help, Michael had said during one of his escalation phase requests, using language designed to create panic and urgency while implying that my grandchildren's welfare was somehow dependent on my willingness to provide immediate financial assistance without questions or verification. The transmission in Jennifer's car completely failed yesterday, and we need to get it fixed immediately because she needs reliable transportation to get to work and take the kids to school and their activities, Michael had continued, presenting what should have been a manageable car repair expense as a family crisis that required emergency intervention. The repair shop says it's going to cost $4,500, and they need payment up front before they'll start the work, so I'm hoping you can help us out so that Jennifer doesn't lose her job, and the kids don't have to miss school and activities. Michael's emergency request had included several manipulation tactics that should have been immediately recognizable to someone with my professional background: artificial urgency that prevented careful analysis, emotional appeals involving my grandchildren's welfare, and financial amounts that seemed disproportionate to the problem being described. But the most concerning aspect had been his obvious assumption that I would provide substantial financial assistance immediately without requiring verification of his claims or exploration of alternative solutions. When I had suggested that Michael get a second opinion on the transmission repair costs and explore financing options that wouldn't require immediate family assistance, his response had revealed the extent to which he had learned to expect that family financial resources should be immediately available to solve any problem he encountered, regardless of the reasonableness of his claims or the availability of alternative solutions. I don't have time to shop around for different quotes and financing options when Jennifer needs her car fixed immediately, Michael had replied with obvious frustration when I suggested that he explore alternatives to immediate family assistance. This is exactly the kind of situation where family is supposed to help each other out, instead of making things more complicated with bureaucratic procedures and unnecessary delays. Michael's response had demonstrated that he viewed basic financial due diligence as bureaucratic procedures rather than reasonable requirements for responsible decision-making, and that he expected family financial assistance to be provided immediately without the verification and analysis that any prudent financial decision should include. Sarah's escalation tactics had been the most emotionally manipulative, exploiting my relationship with her twin daughters and my concern for their educational and developmental opportunities to justify increasingly substantial financial assistance for what were essentially lifestyle choices and poor financial planning, rather than genuine emergencies or temporary difficulties requiring family intervention. Mom, I'm really struggling to keep up with the twins' expenses, and I'm worried that I might have to pull them out of some of their activities if I can't get some help with the costs, Sarah had said during one of her escalation phase requests, using my grandchildren's welfare as emotional leverage to secure financial assistance for expenses that should have been manageable through better budgeting and financial planning. The dance classes and art lessons are so important for their development, and they've been working so hard and making such great progress that it would break my heart to have to tell them they can't continue because I can't afford the tuition, Sarah had continued, presenting discretionary activities as essential expenses while implying that my willingness to provide financial assistance was directly related to my grandchildren's happiness and developmental opportunities. Sarah's manipulation had been particularly effective because it combined genuine concern for my grandchildren's welfare with artificial financial crisis that suggested problems were beyond her control, rather than the result of poor financial planning and unrealistic lifestyle expectations. She had learned to present her financial dependency as affecting my grandchildren's opportunities, rather than simply her own choices about work and lifestyle priorities. But the most revealing aspect of all three children's escalation tactics had been their systematic coordination in timing requests, supporting each other's appeals, and creating collective pressure that made refusing assistance to any individual child seem like abandoning family relationships entirely. They had learned to exploit my desire to treat all my children fairly by ensuring that refusing help to one child would require explaining why I was willing to help others, creating artificial pressure to provide assistance to everyone, regardless of the reasonableness of individual requests. The coordination had become so obvious that my children would reference each other's financial situations when making their own requests, creating implied pressure to help multiple family members simultaneously while making it difficult to establish boundaries or reduce support for specific individuals without seeming to play favorites or abandon family unity and mutual support. I know you've been helping Lisa with her professional expenses and Sarah with the twins' activities, so I hope you can also help me with this car situation so that all of us can get through this challenging period together, Michael had said during one of his requests, explicitly linking my assistance to him with assistance I had provided to his sisters, while suggesting that family fairness required equal financial support regardless of the legitimacy or reasonableness of individual requests. The systematic coordination of manipulation tactics had revealed that my children's financial exploitation had evolved from individual requests based on specific needs to a comprehensive family strategy designed to maximize collective access to my resources while minimizing individual accountability and reciprocal responsibility. They had essentially created a system where my financial security and retirement planning were subordinated to their collective lifestyle choices and financial convenience. Eleanor Richardson had documented every manipulation tactic, every coordination strategy, and every escalation technique that her children had employed during the final 18 months of their financial exploitation campaign. The evidence revealed patterns of psychological manipulation, emotional blackmail, and systematic coordination that transformed individual requests for assistance into a comprehensive exploitation strategy designed to maintain access to my resources while avoiding accountability, reciprocal care, or genuine appreciation. But my children's escalation tactics had also provided me with the final evidence I needed to justify implementing consequences for 30 years of systematic financial exploitation and emotional manipulation. Their willingness to question my mental competence, coordinate psychological pressure campaigns, and escalate manipulation tactics when faced with reasonable requests for accountability had demonstrated that they viewed our family relationships as opportunities for financial exploitation, rather than genuine emotional connections based on mutual care and respect. The escalation phase had revealed the true nature of my children's attitudes toward family financial relationships and their complete lack of genuine appreciation for the sacrifices I had made to support their lifestyle choices and poor financial decisions for 3 decades. They had shown that they were willing to employ any manipulation tactic necessary to maintain access to my resources while avoiding the behavioral change and personal growth that would lead to genuine independence and reduced dependency on family financial assistance. The woman they thought they could manipulate indefinitely through psychological pressure and emotional blackmail was actually someone who had been systematically documenting their exploitation tactics while building a comprehensive case that would eventually expose their true character and force accountability for decades of taking advantage of someone whose only mistake was trusting that family relationships were built on mutual love and respect, rather than one-sided financial exploitation designed to serve their own interests at my expense. The escalation phase was complete, and my children had provided overwhelming evidence that their financial requests were not based on genuine need or temporary difficulties, but rather on entitled expectations that my resources existed to fund their lifestyle choices, regardless of the impact on my own financial security or the sustainability of ongoing assistance arrangements. The documentation was comprehensive, the patterns were undeniable, and the justification for consequences was complete. My children's systematic escalation of manipulation tactics would soon encounter the one thing they had not anticipated: a complete and irrefutable accounting of their true behavior towards someone who had spent 30 years providing unconditional financial support while receiving virtually nothing in return except increasing demands and psychological manipulation, designed to maintain access to resources they had learned to view as their collective entitlement, rather than extraordinary generosity that deserved appreciation and reciprocal care. The morning of October 15th, 2023, my 70th birthday, had begun like any ordinary day, with no indication that by sunset, 30 years of systematic family exploitation would be exposed, 3 decades of financial manipulation would be documented and presented as evidence, and the children who had spent their entire adult lives treating me like their personal bank account would finally learn that some debts eventually come due with interest compounded by years of ingratitude, disrespect, and the kind of systematic emotional abuse that transforms loving family relationships into calculated. I had awakened at 6:30, as I had every morning for the past 47 years, but this particular morning carried the weight of a decision that had been building for months through systematic documentation and professional analysis that had revealed patterns of family financial exploitation so comprehensive and devastating that continuing to protect my children from the consequences of their own behavior would essentially constitute participation in my own systematic impoverishment and emotional abuse. The decision to implement consequences for 30 years of financial exploitation hadn't been made impulsively or emotionally, but rather through the same methodical, analytical process that I had used professionally to build cases against sophisticated financial criminals who used emotional manipulation and systematic deception to exploit vulnerable victims over extended periods of time. My children had demonstrated through their escalating manipulation tactics and coordinated psychological pressure campaigns that they viewed our family relationships as opportunities for financial exploitation rather than genuine emotional connections deserving of mutual respect and reciprocal care. But the most compelling evidence for implementing immediate consequences had been their willingness to question my mental competence and coordinate family interventions designed to maintain access to my financial resources through psychological manipulation and emotional blackmail, rather than simply accepting reasonable boundaries and accountability requirements that any healthy adult relationship should easily accommodate. They had essentially chosen financial exploitation over authentic family relationships, and their choice had finally provided me with the moral justification necessary to stop protecting people who had demonstrated no genuine appreciation for my sacrifices or respect for my well-being. The first hours of my 70th birthday had unfolded exactly as I had anticipated based on 3 years of systematic observation and documentation of my children's behavioral patterns. By 10 o'clock in the morning, none of my 3 children had called, texted, or made any acknowledgement that this was the most significant birthday milestone of my life. By noon, there had been no communication from any of my 8 grandchildren. Despite their obvious awareness of important family dates when gifts or celebrations might be involved. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, it had become clear that my entire family had either completely forgotten my 70th birthday, or had collectively decided that acknowledging this milestone was less important than whatever other activities and priorities were occupying their attention. The silence had been particularly devastating because it represented the logical culmination of 30 years of gradually decreasing appreciation and reciprocal care that had accompanied my family's increasing financial dependency and sense of entitlement regarding my resources and availability. My children had learned to contact me primarily when they needed something, visit mainly when they wanted assistance, and express gratitude only when they were positioning me to provide additional help. The complete absence of birthday acknowledgement had simply been the most obvious manifestation of family dynamics that had been evolving toward this point for decades. But the silence had also been liberating in ways that I hadn't fully anticipated, because it had finally provided irrefutable evidence that my family relationships had become so one-sided and transactional that my children couldn't even be bothered to maintain the minimal courtesy and appreciation that should characterize any healthy relationship, regardless of financial considerations. Their inability to remember or acknowledge my birthday had essentially released me from any remaining obligation to protect them from the consequences of their own systematic ingratitude and exploitation. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I had made the final decision to implement the comprehensive family financial reckoning that my professional analysis had determined was necessary to restore appropriate boundaries and teach long overdue lessons about gratitude, reciprocal responsibility, and the true meaning of family relationships. The documentation was complete, the evidence was overwhelming, and the justification for consequences was unquestionable. My children's systematic exploitation of my generosity would finally encounter the kind of professional accountability and systematic justice that financial predators eventually face when they underestimate their victims and overestimate their own cleverness. The first phase of implementing consequences had involved closing all joint financial accounts and credit arrangements that my children had access to, changing all relevant passwords and authorization codes, and formally notifying my bank and financial institutions that no one other than myself was authorized to access account information or conduct transactions on my behalf. The process had taken approximately 2 hours and had immediately eliminated my children's ability to continue their financial exploitation while I prepared the comprehensive presentation that would expose the full scope of their manipulation and ingratitude. The second phase had involved preparing a detailed financial presentation that documented every dollar I had provided over 30 years, every manipulation tactic they had employed, and every promise they had broken regarding repayment, behavioral change, or reciprocal care. The presentation included bank records, email communications, recorded conversations, and systematic analysis that revealed patterns of exploitation so comprehensive and calculated that no reasonable person could view their behavior as anything other than systematic financial abuse of someone whose generosity they had learned to exploit for their own benefit. But the most important element of the presentation had been the mathematical analysis that demonstrated exactly how my family's financial exploitation had compromised my own retirement security and long-term financial stability. Over 30 years, I had provided more than $240,000 in direct financial assistance, not including the value of services like childcare, transportation, home repairs, and emergency assistance that would have cost substantial additional amounts if purchased from professional providers. The mathematical documentation revealed that my family's lifestyle choices and poor financial decisions had been subsidized at the expense of my own financial goals and security, essentially transforming my retirement planning into a family welfare system that existed to solve other people's problems and fund other people's choices regardless of the impact on my own well-being or future needs. My children had systematically redirected my financial resources from my own security to their convenience, and they had done it so gradually and skillfully that they probably hadn't even recognized how selfish and exploitative their behavior had become. The third phase of implementing consequences had involved scheduling individual meetings with each of my children to present the documented evidence of their financial exploitation and inform them that ongoing financial assistance would be immediately discontinued, pending fundamental changes in their attitudes toward family relationships and reciprocal responsibility. The meetings had been scheduled for the week following my birthday, allowing my children several days to recognize their oversight and attempt to make amends, before discovering that their systematic ingratitude had finally triggered consequences that would permanently alter our family financial dynamics. But my children's response to their forgotten oversight had been even more revealing than their initial neglect. Instead of recognizing their mistake and attempting to make meaningful amends, they had essentially ignored their failure to acknowledge my birthday, while continuing to operate under the assumption that I would remain available for financial assistance and emotional support, regardless of their obvious disregard for my feelings and their systematic failure to provide reciprocal care or genuine appreciation. Lisa had called on October 18th, 3 days after my birthday, not to apologize for her oversight but to request assistance with what she described as an urgent financial situation that required immediate family support to prevent serious consequences for her career advancement and professional reputation. Her complete failure to acknowledge her birthday oversight, while simultaneously requesting substantial financial assistance, had provided the perfect opportunity to begin implementing the comprehensive accountability that her behavior had finally made necessary and justified. "Mom, I really need to talk to you about a financial emergency that just came up," Lisa had said during her phone call, using the same artificial urgency and emotional manipulation that had characterized her financial requests for years. "There's been a situation at work that requires me to come up with $5,000 immediately, and I'm hoping you can help me out so that I don't have to compromise some important professional opportunities that could affect my long-term career prospects." Lisa's request had been notable not just for its timing immediately after forgetting my birthday, but for her obvious assumption that I would provide substantial financial assistance without questions, while she failed to acknowledge her systematic disregard for my feelings and her complete failure to maintain the basic courtesy that should characterize any healthy family relationship. "Lisa, before we discuss any financial assistance, I think we need to talk about something more important," I had responded, using the calm, professional tone that I had developed over 35 years of delivering difficult news to people who weren't prepared to hear uncomfortable truths about their own behavior and choices. I'm curious whether you realize that October 15th was my 70th birthday, and that you didn't call, text, or make any acknowledgement of what should have been an important family milestone. I had continued, giving her the opportunity to recognize her oversight and demonstrate genuine remorse before proceeding with the comprehensive accountability that her systematic exploitation had finally made necessary. Lisa's response to my birthday reminder had been more revealing than any answer she could have provided, because her obvious surprise and defensive reaction had demonstrated that my birthday had been so unimportant to her that she had genuinely forgotten it completely, while remaining fully focused on her own financial needs and professional concerns. "Oh my God, Mom, I'm so sorry," Lisa had said with what appeared to be genuine shock and embarrassment. "I've been so overwhelmed with work stress and financial pressure that I completely lost track of dates and family obligations. I feel terrible about missing your birthday, and I promise I'll make it up to you once I get through this current crisis situation." But Lisa's apology had included the same manipulation tactics that characterized all her interactions with me, framing her oversight as the result of external pressures rather than personal choices about priorities and responsibilities, and positioning her birthday oversight as a temporary mistake that could be resolved through future gestures rather than evidence of systematic disregard for family relationships and reciprocal care. "Actually, Lisa, I don't think this is something that can be made up with future gestures or apologies," I had replied, beginning the conversation that would expose 30 years of documented financial exploitation and systematic ingratitude. "Your birthday oversight wasn't an isolated mistake. It was the logical result of family dynamics that have been developing for decades, and I think it's time we had an honest conversation about the true nature of our relationship and what needs to change going forward." The conversation that followed had been the most difficult and emotionally challenging discussion of my entire life, but it had also been the most necessary and professionally satisfying presentation of evidence and analysis that I had ever delivered. Over the course of 2 hours, I had systematically presented the documented evidence of Lisa's financial manipulation, emotional exploitation, and systematic ingratitude, while explaining exactly how her behavior had compromised my financial security and emotional well-being for decades. "Over the past 30 years, I have provided you with $87,000 in direct financial assistance," I had told Lisa, reading from my comprehensive documentation while she listened in obvious shock and growing horror. "This includes college support, career development assistance, emergency loans, lifestyle subsidies, and ongoing financial help that you have requested and received without providing meaningful repayment, genuine appreciation, or reciprocal care." The mathematical presentation had been devastating in its precision and comprehensiveness, revealing patterns of financial exploitation that Lisa had probably never analyzed or acknowledged even to herself. The documentation showed that her financial requests had increased in frequency and amount over time, while her expressions of gratitude had decreased correspondingly, creating a pattern where my assistance had become so routine and expected that it no longer seemed worthy of special appreciation or reciprocal responsibility. But perhaps more concerning than the financial totals is the documented pattern of manipulation tactics you have used to maintain access to my resources while avoiding accountability, I had continued, presenting examples of her emotional manipulation, artificial urgency, and systematic avoidance of verification or transparency requirements that should have been standard elements of any substantial financial assistance arrangement. The evidence had included recorded conversations, email communications, and detailed analysis of her request patterns that revealed sophisticated manipulation strategies designed to exploit my love for family and my desire to help her succeed, while preventing the kind of careful analysis and boundary setting that would protect my own financial security and emotional well-being. "The most damaging aspect of your behavior has been your systematic avoidance of reciprocal care and genuine family relationship maintenance," I had concluded the presentation by addressing the emotional aspects of her exploitation that were even more hurtful than the financial manipulation. "You contact me primarily when you need something, visit mainly when you want assistance, and express gratitude only when you're positioning me to provide additional help. Our relationship has become completely one-sided, with me providing everything and you providing virtually nothing in return except the minimal appreciation necessary to maintain access to continued assistance." Lisa's response to the comprehensive presentation of documented evidence had been exactly what my professional experience had taught me to expect from financial predators who were confronted with irrefutable proof of their exploitation and manipulation. Shock, denial, defensive anger, and ultimately desperate attempts to maintain access to resources through increased emotional manipulation and guilt-inducing arguments, designed to override factual analysis with appeals to family loyalty and emotional connection. Mom, I can't believe you've been keeping track of every dollar and analyzing our relationship like some kind of business transaction, Lisa had replied with obvious hurt and indignation. I thought family relationships were supposed to be based on love and mutual support, not accounting spreadsheets and documentation of every interaction we've ever had. Lisa's response had been a masterful final example of the manipulation tactics she had been employing for decades, attempting to make me feel guilty for applying systematic analysis to family financial relationships, while ignoring the evidence that showed she had been systematically exploiting my love and generosity for her own benefit, without providing meaningful reciprocal care or genuine appreciation. Actually, Lisa, healthy family relationships should include mutual support, which means that both people provide care and assistance rather than one person funding another person's lifestyle choices indefinitely, I had replied, maintaining the professional composure that had served me well in 35 years of confronting financial criminals with evidence of their crimes. Going forward, all financial assistance will be discontinued immediately, and any future family relationship will need to be based on genuine mutual care and respect rather than financial dependency and systematic exploitation, I had informed her, implementing the consequences that 30 years of manipulation had finally made necessary and justified. The conversations with Michael and Sarah had followed similar patterns, with each child expressing shock at the comprehensive documentation, defensive anger at being held accountable for their systematic exploitation, and desperate attempts to maintain access to financial assistance through increased emotional manipulation and guilt-inducing arguments about family loyalty and love. Michael's response had focused on his supposed right to family financial support based on our previous relationship history, arguing that my documentation and analysis represented a betrayal of family trust rather than appropriate accountability for systematic financial exploitation and manipulation. I can't believe you've been secretly investigating me like I'm some kind of criminal instead of your son who's just been asking for normal family help during difficult times, Michael had said when confronted with evidence of his manipulation tactics and financial irresponsibility. Michael, asking for $63,000 over 15 years while providing virtually no reciprocal care or genuine appreciation is not normal family help, it's systematic financial exploitation, I had replied, presenting the mathematical analysis that revealed his entitled expectations and manipulative behavior. Sarah's response had been the most emotionally manipulative, exploiting my relationship with her twin daughters and attempting to make me feel guilty for implementing consequences that would supposedly harm my grandchildren's welfare and educational opportunities. Mom, I understand that you're upset about feeling unappreciated, but cutting off financial assistance is going to hurt the twins more than it hurts me, Sarah had argued when presented with documentation of her comprehensive financial dependency and systematic avoidance of personal responsibility. Sarah, your financial choices and poor planning are what's affecting the twins, not my decision to stop subsidizing lifestyle choices you can't afford through your own income, I had replied, refusing to allow her to use my grandchildren as emotional leverage to maintain exploitative financial arrangements. The implementation of consequences had been swift and comprehensive, with all three children losing access to the financial assistance that had subsidized their lifestyle choices and poor financial decisions for decades. The immediate impact had been exactly what my professional analysis had predicted. Panic, desperate attempts to negotiate partial restoration of assistance, and ultimately angry accusations that I was being cruel and unreasonable, rather than simply applying appropriate boundaries and accountability to exploitative relationships. But the most satisfying aspect of implementing consequences had been the restoration of my own financial security and the elimination of the systematic stress and emotional manipulation that had characterized family interactions for decades. For the first time in 30 years, I was able to focus on my own financial planning and personal goals without constantly worrying about which family member would need emergency assistance next and how much their latest crisis would cost me in terms of both money and emotional energy. The documentation project that had begun as an investigation into family financial dynamics had evolved into the most comprehensive case of family financial exploitation that I had ever encountered. And implementing consequences had required the same kind of systematic approach and emotional resilience that I had used professionally to help victims of financial crimes restore their security and rebuild their lives after systematic exploitation. Eleanor Richardson had spent 30 years providing unconditional financial support to family members who had systematically exploited her generosity while providing virtually nothing in return except increasing demands and sophisticated manipulation designed to maintain access to resources they viewed as their collective entitlement. The woman they had dismissed as a generous grandmother whose emotions made her financially vulnerable had actually been building the most comprehensive case of family financial exploitation in 3 generations of Richardson history. My children had learned that systematic ingratitude and financial exploitation eventually encounter consequences, and that underestimating someone based on their generosity and family loyalty can result in accountability that extends far beyond uncomfortable conversations and temporary restrictions on financial assistance. They had discovered that forensic accounting skills applied to family relationships can be more devastating than any legal proceeding, and that 30 years of documented evidence can create consequences that permanently alter family dynamics and financial arrangements. The 70th birthday they had forgotten had become the catalyst for the most comprehensive family financial reckoning in Richardson history, and the children who had spent 3 decades taking my endless generosity for granted had finally learned that some debts come due with interest compounded by years of systematic ingratitude and emotional exploitation. 6 months after implementing consequences, my financial security had been completely restored, my emotional well-being had improved dramatically, and my children had begun the difficult process of learning to manage their own financial responsibilities without the family subsidy system they had exploited for decades. Some had begun to acknowledge their exploitation and express genuine appreciation for the years of support they had taken for granted. Others had continued attempting to manipulate and guilt me into restoring financial assistance without demonstrating meaningful behavioral change or genuine accountability. But regardless of their individual responses, all 3 children had learned that Eleanor Richardson was not someone who could be systematically exploited indefinitely, and that family relationships based on financial convenience rather than genuine mutual care eventually become unsustainable for everyone involved. The documentation had been preserved as evidence of what happens when generosity is met with entitlement rather than appreciation, and the consequences had been implemented with the precision and thoroughness that only comes from professional investigative skills applied to personal relationships. My 70th birthday had been forgotten, but the lesson about gratitude, reciprocal responsibility, and the true meaning of family relationships would be remembered for generations. Sometimes justice comes not from elaborate confrontations or dramatic revelations, but from simply stopping the protection of people who have demonstrated that they value your resources more than they value your well-being, and that systematic documentation of exploitation is the most powerful weapon against people who assume that family loyalty means tolerating unlimited financial abuse without consequences. The woman who had spent 30 years being systematically underestimated while quietly building the most comprehensive case of documented family financial exploitation in Richardson history had reminded everyone that forensic accounting skills, combined with moral authority and systematic evidence gathering, can deliver justice that is more complete and permanent than any legal proceeding. My children had learned that some people are far more dangerous than they appear, and that pushing the wrong grandmother too far can have consequences that extend far beyond hurt feelings, to encompass the complete restoration of appropriate boundaries and the permanent establishment of healthy family relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided financial exploitation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.